The romantics, it's lovely romantic.
Secondly,
notion.
we're not talking about rebuilding the Parthenon. I'm sorry if you came here under that misapprehension. We're talking about the reunification of the sculpture of the Parthenon that was carved as a narrative in stone that makes no sense to keep in two separate pieces at opposite ends of the European Union.
In my mind, an ownership question. This is a reunification argument. Where can you best appreciate what is essentially one monument? I mean, it's as if I told you that you would cut the Mona Lisa in half, and you would have half of it at the Louvre and half of it at the British Museum. Do you think your viewers would appreciate the beauty of the painting in such a way? Well, this is exactly what happened with the Parthenon.
Greece was under Ottoman occupation, an occupied country. Let me give you a little example of where it sits in. So imagine that when France, Paris, was under Nazi occupation, the Nazis, before the Americans came into the war, decided to sell the top of the Eiffel Tower, not all the Eiffel Tower, just the top of the Eiffel Tower, to the Americans. And the Americans took it and they put it next to the Statue of Liberty. Would that be acceptable? Would you agree with that?
If you travel to London today and visit the British Museum, there's a room there which has an exquisite collection of ancient Greek sculptures. These statues go by many names, usually referred to as the Parthenon marbles, or in Greek, marmara tu Parthenona. But you've probably heard it most commonly referred to as the
Elgin Marbles.
Elgin Marbles.
The Elgin Marbles.
Elgin Marbles.
The Elgin Marbles.
These statues were once attached to the original Parthenon in Athens, one of the most iconic buildings of Greek history, a temple built in honor of the goddess Athena during the height of Athens' power in the 5th century BC. So how did these ancient sculptures that were once attached to the Parthenon end up in a museum in London? And why is the Greek government pressuring Britain to return its stolen marbles? The story begins with a Scotsman named Thomas Bruce, otherwise known as Lord Elgin. Lord Elgin had a long and successful career in the British Army and was given the illustrious position as ambassador of Great Britain to the Ottoman Empire in 1798, to solidify the newfound relationship that Britain had with the Ottomans, who used to be formally allied to France until Napoleon decided to invade Egypt, a territory previously controlled by the Turks. But when Britain destroyed the French fleet at the Battle of the Nile in 1798, the Ottomans began to see the British in a new light. This was more or less the state of the world when Lord Elgin set off for Constantinople in 1799. His mission? To spread influence and strengthen British relations with the Ottomans. But Elgin also had another mission in mind, something he was very passionate about. As a nobleman, Elgin had many friends in high places who were interested in the arts, particularly classical architecture, and they convinced him it was the perfect opportunity to document classical architecture in Greece, which was an occupied territory of the Ottoman Empire at the time. In the late 18th and 19th century, Greek architecture was all the craze in Europe. The movement was called Greek Revival, and it flourished in Northern Europe, the United States, and Canada. Many Western nations were looking to ancient Greece for inspiration to beautify their cities. The Greek revivalist movement considered ancient Greek architecture to be the pinnacle of art. And in those days, the only way you could actually see Greek architecture was to physically go there and document it for yourself. And by doing this, Elgin aimed to improve the knowledge and skill of British architects and make them the best in the world. Before his departure to take up his new post, he approached officials in the British government to inquire if they would be interested in employing artists to take casts and drawings of the sculpted portions of the Parthenon. According to Elgin, the answer of the government was entirely negative. But Elgin was as determined as ever and decided to fund his own team of artists to go to Greece to take plaster molds and sketch ancient Greek monuments in an effort to benefit the architects and artists back in Britain.
The removal and bringing back to London of the Elgin Marbles is very simple. It is to improve the arts in Great Britain. He sees it as an educational enterprise.
Elgin actually hired a famous Italian artist from Sicily by the name of Giovanni Battista Lucieri, who was a master in photorealistic painting, so there was no better man to lead the team of artists and molders. While Elgin was attending to his ambassadorial duties in Constantinople, Lucieri and his team got to work at the Acropolis in Athens. They quickly discovered they weren't allowed onto the Acropolis without the proper permits from the Sultan, a contract known as a firman in Turkish. At the time, the Ottomans were using the Acropolis as a kind of fortress or garrison. They had been doing so for quite some time. It had even been bombarded by cannon fire in a battle with the Venetians in the previous century. Luckily for Elgin, the British victory over France in 1801 led France to capitulate and abandon their holdings in Egypt. 3 weeks later, Elgin got his firman. The document stated 3 things: to be able to enter the Acropolis, to draw and model the ancient sculptures with plaster, to erect scaffolding, and to dig for new discoveries. And lastly, gave them the liberty to take away any sculptures or inscriptions which did not interfere with the works or walls of the citadel. The firman essentially gave Elgin and his team a loophole to take pieces which had fallen off the Parthenon in the previous centuries. However, many researchers and academics today have debunked the claim, proving that such a document never even existed. Turkish researchers have not found any evidence of the document in the official imperial archives of the Ottoman Empire.
Well, there's no evidence whatsoever that the Ottoman authorities gave Lord Elgin prior written permission to do what he did. And in fact, all the evidence that can be assembled, all the historical evidence that can be assembled indicates that Lord Elgin never asked for permission to remove the marbles from the high walls of the Parthenon. He never got permission to do that. And when he received word when he was in Constantinople that his agents in Athens had removed 1 or 2 pieces from the high walls, he was ecstatic and surprised. The Turkish firman was translated into Italian, which the British Parliament then translated into English. And they did that in 1816. Okay? Mm-hmm. So that suggests that when this document was written, it wasn't a final document because the final document would have included the name of the courier who was going to carry the document. Moreover, the Italian document is not dated. You don't have final documents without a date. What's more, it's not signed. Mm-hmm. And what's more, there's no signet on it. And lastly, it's in Italian. Now, that's a little bit more complicated, but it's worth getting out on the table.
There is no formal text of a document which authorized him to do what he in fact did, which was remove the materials that he did.
The Acropolis was in a rough shape at that time, with sculptures and bits and pieces of it scattered all around. One of the main reasons for this was back in 1687, the Venetians, who were longtime foes of the Ottomans, were trying to capture Athens and fired a cannon shot directly at the Parthenon, which the Turks had been using as a fort and ammo storage. It was a direct hit, igniting the gunpowder and causing an explosion, pretty much blowing the Parthenon to pieces, causing massive damage and leaving it in ruins. The explosion scattered fragments all over the surrounding area, which many locals used to build homes or illegally sold as souvenirs to tourists. By the time Elgin arrived years later, he was able to scavenge the ground for what was remaining. But that wasn't enough for old Elgin. He took the liberty to bribe local authorities to allow his team to literally saw off sculptures that were still attached to the standing structure of the Parthenon. Elgin's team physically removed about half of the surviving statues on the Parthenon and shipped them back to Britain. This included 21 figures from the east and west pediments, 15 metope panels, and 246 feet of the Parthenon frieze, which was a continuous narrative sculpture that ran around the outside of the inner wall of the Parthenon. In the process of sawing off the sculptures, Elgin's team caused great damage to the Parthenon. Lucieri even admitted in a letter to Elgin that he was obliged to be more barbarous to get the job done. In 1802, one of the ships carrying a portion of the looted sculptures sank off the coast of the island of Kythera, and it took Elgin 2 years to recover them at his own expense. This entire expedition bankrupted Elgin, costing him around £74,240, which is the equivalent of 75 million today. Elgin was not the wealthiest of noblemen, but he married rich. In the years he was away, his wife was cheating on him and ended up leaving him for another man. So Elgin ended up losing access to his wife's family's money in the process, leaving him with no other choice but to sell the statues to the British government, which agreed to buy them for only £35,000, less than half of Elgin's debts. In 1816, the sculptures ended up in the British Museum, where they have been ever since. A few years later, in 1821, the Greeks won a bloody war for independence against the Ottoman Empire. It wasn't long before the Greek government began to pressure the British to return the sculptures.
So this is where our government comes in with the notion of legality, because the state, that is the British then state, 1816, paid Elgin £35,000, which is a considerable sum today in millions, in order to partially recompense him. And that, therefore, they claimed was buying something that they then, by buying them from Elgin, owned. Well, if you think about it, the then government of Greece was actually, of course, an imperial external government from Turkey, Ottoman Turkey. Ottoman Turkey doesn't exist today. Would we justify the claim of any state which by an imperial closure, an imperial foreclosure, deemed that something was theirs simply by act of will and power? I don't think so.
I wrote a book saying that the British Museum should return to Athens the chunks of the sculpture of the Parthenon, sometimes called the Elgin Marbles, always pronounced wrongly in this country. It was Lord Elgin, in fact, hard G, that they had annexed in the 18th century. They didn't make any sense that the sculpture should be separated. It was carved as a unity. That the original crime was the desecration of a great historic culture and a great historic temple, a gross insult to an entire culture and society of the Greeks, the amputation of an organic and aesthetic whole, a theft, a rape, a taking, perpetrated by the strong upon the weak. By the way, this was all done at the same time as the British fleet, Her Majesty's fleet, was also the military guarantor of the slave trade, of the triangular trade of the Atlantic and the Middle Passage. Now, the points I made on this, how justice could be done, how reparation could be made, how a wrong once inflicted could be restored, made good, I could well buttress by fact and could do so now if I was challenged. Additionally, I suppose most importantly, I said that while not every crime committed in the high days of empire and war and plunder could be repaired, this one could. Restitution could be made. That sculpture had been wrenched from its context. It had been broken up, it had been segregated, it had been injured, it had been damaged in the process. Not everything could be put right, but most of it could. It could be reunited, and the scars and the missing fragments and the injuries would be just part of that great narrative once the healing, once the reunification had been more or less accomplished.